Now afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. You have a wide variety of speakers to attend, so thanks for coming to listen to me. As Ms. Williams had said, my name's Jeremy Landvater. You can call me Jeremy. You can call me Lieutenant Commander Landvater. You can call me Dr. Landvater. You can just wave at me. So a couple things. I always have to talk about disclosures. I have no federal, no state, and no other disclosures. And nothing I say represents the United States government, the DoD, or anything with the Navy in any ways. But also the disclosure is this, I don't want it to be a traditional business lecture, so I roam around because I get bored standing still. And also, at some level, to be interactive. Also, I apologize, I'm getting over a bit of a cold from 2 weeks ago, but the cough still isn't completely gone. So I was asked to, it sounds like one of our themes is discussing how think, value, communicate, and lead, how we use that in kind of everyday life, everyday business. So quickly, a couple of the things that I do, as Ms. Williams had said about being a department head. The clinic staff's about 30 people, 11 clinicians, myself as a psychiatrist, other psychiatrists, nurse practitioners, social workers, and psychologists, as well as a staff of other clinical and non-clinical. I'm also an assistant professor of psychiatry through the Uniformed Services University, a diplomat in the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, a member of the North Carolina Psychiatric Association Legislative Committee, and also a member of the American College of Healthcare Executives, because once I left here, I was a healthcare administrator before I ever went to med school. So I did things kind of backwards. Why do I say about this, and it's not to brag? Understanding thoughts, or how we think, the value it provides, communicating and leading, this is every day in every single one of these organizations that I work with and through and report to. So, as you've probably seen, I have the topic of my, my discussion up here. So, the dynamic analysis of how thoughts, values, communications, and leadership achieve success. So, I did purposefully choose these words. And kind of a bad psych joke is, this is not dynamics as of psychodynamic psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, but I liked the words because what does dynamic mean? I know the very basic Google definition is up there, but what is the definition of dynamic? Someone can read it off, yell something out. Absolutely. And what kind of change? Does it? It can be exciting. It can be terrible, too. It can be terribly exciting. But constant change, activity or progress. Or we also think about the relationships and the cause and effect that each kind of data point has on each other. Now, that's an infinite possibility, but it's something we have to think about. So, analysis. Who wants to yell out a definition of analysis? And actually, I have to say, I stuck with more of a philosophical definition of these, not like a pure physical or from physics or math or something like that. Absolutely. So looking into something kind of with the fine-tooth comb, trying to really understand how it's put together, maybe what factors influence other factors, like dynamic analysis. And so for today, it's to look through like what is the relationship of all this to our thoughts, our values, our communication style, and leadership. So thoughts. I'm a bit biased. I like thoughts. I like learning about thoughts, looking at thoughts. What do we do with thoughts? Because, well, I'm a psychiatrist by training and trade primarily. But so, what are thoughts? Someone just yell something out.
Rumination.
Can be. Of the mind, not of the stomach. So, in part of the theme of today, we're asked about how does thinking was critically and holistically based on sound business knowledge. So thoughts. Well, physiologically, they're kind of these nerve impulses by neurotransmitters that come from the front part of your brain and go to other front parts of your brain, or the prefrontal cortex, and may go to the amygdala or other parts more in the midbrain for processing and memory attachment and emotional attachment and whatnot. That's on the physiological side. But on the philosophical side, what are thoughts? Can anyone really answer that question? It's just things going through our mind. There might be a reason for them. There might not be. What causes thoughts? Are your thoughts voluntary? Are they involuntary? I think about breathing. Is breathing voluntary or involuntary? Kind of both. You do have some voluntary control over it until you can't hold your breath anymore. And then you're going to start breathing again. But there's also, so thinking of things like your conscious, your stream of conscious, as you're sitting here right now, maybe listening to me, maybe not, because you just need to complete making sure you got enough, sessions you went to. You're thinking about other things. And don't lie to me, because I know you are, because that's human nature. We all have this stream of consciousness that we think through, maybe not even actively think through. It just happens. Minds wander. But we can also kind of rein our minds in. And that would be the voluntary control of thought. So like when we're studying, when we're taking tests, when we're doing something purposefully, sending an email, things like that. Where do our thoughts come from? Anyone? Anyone? The brochure, it says explore together. So thoughts can come from anywhere, and they don't need a specific reason. Thoughts can come from our knowledge base. So what did we learn in school? What did we learn from our parents? What did we learn by watching the football game over the weekend? Good knowledge and bad knowledge. Also from our experience of when we learned good things and bad things. And sometimes there's no reason at all. It's just thoughts. And then, what is the content of our thoughts? Are they kind of, I'll say maybe more reasonable, like, man, I'm hungry. Need to go get something to eat. Or, boy, I don't know. I can't wait till I can fly. Or something of that nature that maybe it's not quite as rational. And then what about our each individual thought processes? Are you someone who's kind of linear? Like, okay, I need to do step A, then step B, then step C, and such. Or so something like a serial processing. Are you a parallel processor? It's like I can manage 6 things together at the same time. I'm not that person. Ask anyone who's worked with me for a little while. I'm not that person. The next item to ask the comment on is value. So what is value? In a room full of budding business professionals, somebody should be able to answer this. Oh, go ahead. Absolutely. Is there a limit on our definition of value? I don't think there's actually any answer to this. In my opinion, it's no. But, so a fun guess, so it's putting up there appreciation for importance of ethics, diversity, globalization, natural environment, developing and articulating one's own values. I'm using what I call like my MBA lobe right now, my hard, cold science, nothing but facts and figures, don't care about any of the squishy, happy stuff. What's missing in that definition? And why am I so happy that it's missing? There's no dollar sign. It doesn't talk about monetary value, because value is not always monetary. Oftentimes we think of it that way, as in more tangible or intangible ways, of how do things affect the bottom line? What value does this person or this service? And we like to think about it in terms of dollars and cents, but that is not always the case. So, what is appreciation? I told you I like thoughts, so I'm going to try to make people think. So I like to think of appreciation, at least for sake of the talk today, in 2 ways. There's kind of the philosophical, that you enjoy the person's company, or that you like how the hot meal that the restaurant serves kind of warms you up and nourishes you. That can be, or that how someone or something makes your life easier. Like, I don't remember how in the world we lived before the invention of the Apple or the iPhones. So I remember they came out while we were still working together. But Well, one of the things I think is also interesting is it's very much a homonym. I think in I'm going into more finance and things like that. What do we normally mean by appreciation then? That's the opposite of depreciation, something that is gaining value, but gaining a monetary value. But I'd say one of the things to think about is appreciation and value. You can have an appreciation of an increase in value, and it doesn't have to be monetary. And in my opinion, that's how many of these are linked. How do we value value? Can you put your finger on it? Can you measure it? Do you just know it when you see it? Absolutely. It's relative at best. You have to, in some ways, it's like I went to Texas Tech, so I spent several years out in the Wild West, beautiful Texas. You have to build a corral to define it. You have to set some perimeters, or you won't be able to define it, because it is undefinable unless you set some parameters for it. What are your own values? No one has to answer this unless they want to. Can they change? Have they changed? I can almost assure you, if they haven't already, they will. The values you have now are not the values you had when you were 10, which is not when you were 15, which is not what you had when you were 25, or about to have when you're 25, or 30, or 40, or 70, or on your deathbed. They'll change, usually. Communication. So I purposefully took this a little bit different direction because we talk about being, a good writer, a good speaker, a good whatever. You rehearsed your presentation a few times. You made sure when you were on this Zoom presentation that the dog wasn't attacking the ceiling fan in the background. True story from a few weeks ago from me. Thanks to my wife, the dog did not attack the ceiling fan. But I wanted to break this down into some elements of communication that you're all probably aware of, but maybe you never thought to organize it like this. See, thoughts. When you are speaking or watching somebody speak, and for that matter, if you're reading something, it gets harder, but there's things to interpret. Of the speaker or the communication pathway that you're so choosing to use, how do you show alertness? How do you know right now that I'm not in a coma? I'm up and walking around and talking. Now, I could be dissociating, but I'm not in a coma. So how alert are you to your audience? How alert is the person to you? Because communication's both ways. Sometimes as a leader, you have to assess, like, hey, is this employee or is even this boss, do they understand what I'm saying? Or do they even care? Interaction. How are you interacting with people or the audience, and how are they interacting with you? It's one of the reasons I don't like to stand a lot. One, because my foot starts to go numb. The other part is I like moving around. Articulation. And it's not just, are you getting your point across? Are you speaking clearly? Like, my voice right now is a little muffled because I have a cough drop in. I don't know if you can tell, but it does change my articulation a little bit because my cheeks pouched out a little bit and I got some extra saliva I don't normally have. What is the characteristics of the speech? How fast is it? How slow is it? Is someone screaming? Is someone whispering? Are they talking in a monotone? So right before lunch, it's really hard to pay attention. Things to consider. Movements. Now, I'm moving around. I would say it's kind of generally normal. But if I'm just doing this the whole time, it would be really distracting. And hopefully I'm not distracting you with what I'm doing now. Facial expressions. Well, and obviously it depends. If you're writing something, facial expression probably doesn't matter too much. But like, are you smiling? Are you frowning? Do you show like you are genuinely interested in what you're talking about or trying to get your point across, at least by your face? Because like, I can't really like get that across with my knee. Do it with my face and vocal qualities. And reliability. part of communication that maybe you may not have thought of before is, how reliable is this person? Is this story? Do their words make sense? Are they speaking? Have they created some reliability that you know their reputation from their past experience? Is this someone who seems fake when they're talking? Like, well, you seem too happy or too superficial or something like that. I do have a bit of a trivia question for anyone. Has anyone ever thought about or looked at assessing communication like this before? This is where I get some cheating points, but yes, sir.
Well, I mean, I spent my whole life in sales. All this reflection in the voice. When we sold our business, I remember the CFO actually, had to present the financials. He was very, in his profile, a C profile, very squared away guy. And he actually wrote everything, his name, everything about what he was going to talk about. My name is Mark Jeremy. And so when he got to the balance sheet, he said, "This is the balance sheet." I said, "Reflect it. This is a healthy balance sheet." And we pointed out a couple things about this balance sheet. Some reflection, eye contact, healthy versus, versus some other word. So you're trying to, that's
Add some flair, add some energy, some make people engaged. So where I say I kind of cheat on this, I don't know why anyone has, but has anyone ever heard of something called a mental status exam? Psychologists and psychiatrists use it. It's our version of like listening to your heart. I stole this directly from that. I mean, I changed some of the words so it wasn't like overly medical or boring. But I thought it was a great way because that's how we tried to convey how someone's presenting themselves. And I noticed after training, and although I've only been out of residency for 2 years, I'm starting to look and see how other people use this, whether it be my coworkers, employees, how I present myself to other people, because it's a good framework and it covers all the same, like, you don't have to be a clinician to appreciate this, but I thought it was just a good way of kind of concisely organizing it. Leading, being prepared to make a difference and achieve positive outcomes in diverse settings. Well, there's nothing wrong with how that's written, and it's well written. There's a lot of buzzwords in it, but they're good buzzwords. Change can be good, change can be bad. Same with buzzwords. So I didn't want to do an overly military presentation, although I come in, obviously, in uniform. So leadership, right? Military. So what are the Navy 4 Corps leadership attributes? What are the Marine Corps 11 leadership principles? Anybody know them? I don't know them either. They're just, if you ever look them up, they're good. It's know your people, know yourself, do good things, treat people the way you want to be treated. Golden rule, be smart. But what is your definition of leadership? You can yell it out or just think about it. There's no one definition of leadership. There's some commonalities, but after that first phrase or two, it's anything. But something to ask yourself, your organization or your team or wherever you're at, what is their definition of leadership? If the two of you vary by much, back up. What type of leader does your organization need? Because the leader that is needed, what's your organization's definition of leadership, and how you define leadership could be three very different things. And all three be completely correct. That is where then to evaluate, to think critically, think holistically. Am I the right person to lead this? Yes or no? Do I need to change my leadership style? Do I have to consider not necessarily changing my values, but looking at something in a different way? Do they need a more charismatic leader? Do they need a less charismatic leader? Do they need somebody who has a stronger background in operations management? Well, dang, I'm an HR guy. Maybe I don't fit in so well to this. It's things to think about. So, wanted to check for time as well. I'm definitely not a wizard with graphs, so apologies on this. But, so, and I know that I see a few faces. Who came to listen to me last year? And I thought you looked familiar, but so I put up something called the Hexaflex, and I said how everything's related. Well, guess what? This is this year's version of it. But I did it not because I ran out of ideas, but because I hope that everyone can gain an appreciation for how interconnected everything is. That's dynamics. The analysis is then done within your own head, within your own team, to understand how each one of those elements, it's very much like a chess game, but a chess game where all the pieces are attached by rubber bands. So every time something moves, something else is also going to move. Maybe for the better, maybe for the worse. Maybe it just doesn't matter. Just moving one back and forth to try to protect the king one more round. What this tries to show is that communications linked to thinking, which is linked to value, which is linked to leading, and back and forth, and just a whole big system of arrows. But this is two-dimensional. What dimension is life in? Anyone who wants to like nerd out and tell me about the 11 different dimensions with electromagnetic radiation and using time as a dimension and whatnot, you're completely valid. I'm just not prepared to answer that. I think a three-dimensional analysis is more likely. Anybody have any? Well, it says on the bottom I believe that's methane. But the way I was going to look at it, that I kind of look at it, it's like, well, it's kind of a pyramid because it's not two-dimensional. It's not flat. It's roundish. It has structure. But at the middle of all of this is to never forget it's you or your organization or your family or whatever you want to define that's in the middle. And thinking, value, leading, and communication is all equally spaced at a perfect 109-degree point something angle away from each other. And there are some competing interests that, I don't think I have the pointer, but on the black in between the white balls, there's some kind of forces that put them so perfectly apart from each other, but also perfectly in line with each other. That way, or because my thought on that is the interactions, like I said, don't happen in a plane. They're not flat. They happen in three dimensions. They're all interrelated to each other. And just for that picture, just because value is on that leg that's going towards the back, that doesn't mean it's any less important. That just means I had to put something back there because I didn't have a physical model to show you. So, as we're starting to run a little lower on time to allow time for questions, can you or will you and your organization be successful or have success without diligence to understanding the relationships between thoughts, value, communication, and leadership? Because to be an effective leader, this is in my mind, but to be an effective leader, you have to understand communication. You have to understand thoughts. You have to understand values. But at the same time, maybe you're not a leader, but you still have to think through different items and evaluate your leader. Maybe you're also not a good fit for your leader. Or maybe you're learning from that leader of how to be a better leader. And how can you communicate without understanding the leadership style that's necessary for your organization or for your specific mission, if you will, without understanding the values of your organization, monetary or non-monetary? And how can you understand anything without thinking through it? I don't think that's possible, but I'm biased. And algorithms that don't require much thought can get us far. But I'm always open to friendly debate, even unfriendly, just don't throw stuff at me. Is it feasible to be able to have success without understanding the relationships of those? And then one step farther, is it possible? Like maybe if you scale things down and you're self-employed, not being that self-employed's a bad thing, but I'm just saying like to like minimize the amount of others you would have to work with. Maybe then, but I would still say is you have to understand the value, how you're propositioning yourself, how you're communicating. Even if you are perhaps even homeless, you still have a sign. You're still communicating to achieve your goal, which I'm assuming is to seek food and shelter and whatnot. Alrighty. So on that actually, I want to go back real quick. I'm just curious, because I saw some of the other ones. Have other presentations challenged you to think about thoughts, values, communications, and leadership? So, to you, I am sorry to hear that, but for me, that makes me really happy. The reason why, not that I'm like reveling in other people's misery or things like that, is I can't always bring the best, like this is a super cool story or this like super new shiny widget that we invented and it like saved billions of dollars and whatever. But the thought process or thinking or buzzword phrase, expanding your mind, is hoping that something I could bring you, and something that we don't always get in a kind of a business seminar or business lecture, because I mean there are just focused things we have to learn. I'm also kind of anti-bias. It's things we don't normally get coming from a military lecturer, because we have to be really in the box for a good reason, usually. So I didn't have questions. I want to say as a thank you, as I started off with, that you had multiple choices of things to come to, but you chose to come here. Some of you were kind of socially obligated. Some of you returned for a second year. But this time I wanted to open up for questions, but before I do, so last year I had my fun picture at the end when I was standing with the howitzer. This was this spring. I was standing on top of one of the mountains of Bodo Fjord in Norway, where I was part of something. It was a NATO exercise called Cold Response that I was there for a few weeks. It's not nearly as cold as it looks, but you get lots of cold weather gear, and we were able to fly up there with the help of some of our friends with the Osprey squadrons, and at least got a good photo op and also some good chance for some overseas duty. But that's just for fun. Completely unrelated, other than having to use things like thoughts, values, communication, and leadership to achieve my mission, which was to advise 2 different generals and some of our senior medical commanders. So I open up the floor to your questions. Yes, sir.
That looks like springtime because you're not wearing gloves.
So it is springtime, because that was like April 1st or April 2nd. The main reason why not wearing gloves is so the person taking this is my corpsman HM2 whiny, who we had to take our gloves off to try to attempt to take the pictures, because they're glove mitten kind of things, and when you are riding in the back of the Osprey, you definitely want to make sure you had those on.
I have a question for you. I'll play a song.
Yeah.
My question, you talked about our thoughts controlled, or if they're happening. We have all kinds of issues sometimes controlling our thoughts. So if you have any advice on how to control thoughts and directing thoughts.
How many hours do you have? I'll give a very high-level, quick response. The best, maybe one of the best ways, is knowing yourself, not you personally, but everyone knowing their self. If that is something that you have a harder time with, it's ways to try to organize yourself when your thoughts are on. So is it a schedule? Is it a task list? Is it a deadline? So some of those kind of memory reminders, things that, if you know that applies to you. If you have a hard time managing that yourself, asking a colleague or a trusted friend, your relative, it's like, hey, keep me on track for this. And then ways to minimize distractions. Like I keep an open door policy, but a lot of times my door is like open only about a foot, because I am very much, if something else is going on, I'm out there, it's like, what's going on? It's like, oh wait, that doesn't apply, but then it's something that piqued my interest, so I had popped out. very fast answer to a very complex question, but does that somewhat satisfy? Yeah. So that's the nice thing, because also with dynamic questions, you can dance around answers. Because there's no, it's those single like yes or no questions where it's like, dang, well now I'm trapped. I got a 50-50 shot. I saw a variety, so yeah.
I got a mic, so I'll bring it around to y'all. He was close.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned only being out of residency for 2 years. After all the years of studying and being in the Navy, what helped you like focus and stay true to like being successful and finally becoming what you are today? Just like not losing sight of that.
So the answer I have is I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. And I actually want to sit this down. I have a very atypical career path, but knowing it's wanting to go farther or having interest, and for me, there was always the interest in the military. But then, like I was an undergrad when 9/11 happened. So then, sorry, I'm somewhat of an aside. So knowing that I wanted to essentially go farther, be in not necessarily positions of authority for authority's sake, but have some influence in the way things are done. But then also finding ways to keep myself engaged, because like I was very interested in business. I was very interested in medicine. But you can't do everything at once, or you can if you have a lot of money and infinite time. So it was always kind of like, you hear about like what's the 50-year plan and the 20-year plan and the 10-year plan. And it was always to kind of have a couple options, then to see, in a way, it was almost like a life decision tree. It's like, okay, what option is here? What option is here? What will satisfy my desires of things that I wanted to do? And then what is then feasible? That's how I was able to keep kind of stepping and also kind of keeping it similar-ish, like although a lot of things aren't related, but it was still within the DoD, or it was still with being an officer, or it was still with being in medicine, or things like, or even now getting back to kind of my business roots, because I'm only essentially a physician half the time. The other half of the time, I'm a complete administrator. So I guess, and it's having like your eye long term, but not, at least for me, was not focusing long term. It was kind of taking advantages of the opportunities as they arose, kind of much like stepping stones on the way to an island. I'm not even sure if I'm on that island yet. We'll let time determine that. You're next, sir.
Okay.
You mentioned a little bit
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was going to say it hasn't much, but I'll tell you why. Because I've been so institutionalized over nearly the last 18 years, I don't remember how I thought before that. And I don't mean that as a bad thing. That just kind of created some cognitive framework. But I will say in some level of not saying like rigid, hard, leadership, because there's rigidity within the DoD because there's things need to happen a certain way. But residency training, or certainly kind of the training, the residency training, did help me understand some of those. And I don't know if it was the training, if it was me just getting older, or me now like experiencing things, is to be kind of more cognitively flexible. It's like obviously understanding there's a variance or various opinions and whatnot, but it's maybe listening to them more, considering them more, and how they influence you and how you influence them. So I'm not sure if that was a byproduct of training, of experience, or just stage of life. Absolutely. Yes, sir. Absolutely.
You spoke briefly about organization and employee having different definitions of leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk briefly a bit more about if there's like adverse side effects of that, or if it's a good thing or a bad thing? And then a follow-up question to that would be, how can an organization and an employee work together to have the same definition of leadership?
So adverse side effects, so probably no headache, no nausea, vomiting, no shortness of breath. Sorry. There could be a lot of heartache, but so I think the first part is like when it happened. What's actually the first part of the first part of the question? Repeat that just to make sure I answer it more directly instead of with a bad joke.
An organization in the way having different
So obviously somewhere like if it's greatly different, it could impact the kind of the office relationship or even the organizational leadership. But I don't feel, as someone who I have colleagues and some of those that I have the privilege of leading that do have a different opinion of leadership. And what I would say is it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It depends if it's constructive or destructive. Because there's certainly things that I have pointed out to people and people have pointed out to me. And it's like, man, what we really need or we could really use is whatever. It's like, that's an excellent point. Well, I can change that or I can influence that, if possible. Sometimes you can't. Then it also can be destructive. Like, oh, we need down with leadership, or we need much more authoritarian rule, or something like that. Then the impact that would have on the organization is, could you then accomplish, what your mission and vision is, or couldn't you? So I think it's not necessarily good or bad. It can be either, and I would kind of look at it as more of as constructive or destructive. And even if it's destructive, it may not be bad. Like sometimes an entity needs to break up or dissolve or something like that. So even if it's destructive, it may not be a bad thing. It may be for the greater good. That's like an overly rosy picture, and I can't give you an example off the top of my head, but I think it would be possible. The third part, or did I cover the third part in my ramble?
Second part was how can an organization
This is probably an oversimplification. I think it comes down to just a conversation. It's like, hey, what do you think about leadership? Well, hey, what do you think about leadership? Well, where do we agree and where do we disagree? And do we have disagreements that need to be rectified? Because there's kind of like the different levels of agreement, like tier one, like, we're just going to start fighting it out right here in the office, to like, okay, that's a small variance of opinion, but we can proceed with this. That's just maybe a philosophical or a quirk thing. So to have the same definition, I guess the initial part is to ask, but also maybe something that should be addressed, or maybe through something like a shared mission and vision statement or something like that. So at least everyone has an understanding. And that level maybe is someone's like, hey, this style isn't for me, and this organization is like really committed to this style. Then maybe it's best for me to go elsewhere or do something else. You are welcome. So I don't remember, but somebody raised their hand over here. Yes, sir.
It was piggybacking off your model, and you kind of hit on one of the things that I looked at as soon as I saw it was where you said in the center's unit or in the center's organization, or I saw it as and. There's a unit, there's an and organization, there's my other coworkers, and how do these overlap? Because we're all going to have those different values.
Yep.
And it was generally getting back to then, once we have those different forces and those different books, how do we come to understand? We can't just get rid of everybody that doesn't see everything the same as the organization.
One of the things I viewed, like if I would have thought about it, I would have picked up a bag of Jacks beforehand. Because it's almost like, all right, everyone has limited time. And usually there's some limit of time. And it's like ball bounces. How many can you swipe up? And then how do they fit in your hand? There's no, once again, I don't give wishy-washy answers on purpose because it's the dynamics, it depends. Is how to make it work is, in general, how is it not working or how is it working? Are people, situations, problems, are they compatible? Because sometimes they are. Sometimes it's just much like fitting the jacks in your hand. If you get like some of the ones that are kind of overlapping, you'll fit more in your hand. Or is it like trying to grab a porcupine? No matter how you grab it, you're just getting stuck full of quills. Now, assuming somebody isn't being like overly like yelling or violent or something like that, usually there can be civil discussion to say it's like, hey, how are we going to solve this going forward? with opportunities to be more engaged or exit or whatnot. I know it kind of comes back to having the ability to have a conversation. But at least in my mind, that's that's kind of how things come down to. Or through however, maybe marketing materials or whatnot. If I think about organizations that have a strong like image or branding or like a strong sense of values, and not saying that their values are good or bad, but they're just very immersed in that value, that it's kind of known like, hey, if you're here, this is kind of what we expect. And it's so well known that you should have known this before you applied. So that is a way to get some cohesion. It might minimize your diversity though. I say diversity in a kind of a not world, but in a general sense. Who else? Do you have a question? Yeah, fixing your hair. Sorry, I didn't mean to call you out, but I wanted to make sure if you had a question. Anything else? I will turn it back over to Ms. Williams or set you free or.
I want to thank y'all for coming. I think food and networking is next. So that should be a nice way to end the day.
And I'll be up front for a while, so anyone else that wants to chat about anything, come on up.